Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show where the topic is how to answer questions and essays. And I'm delighted to welcome Kate Flatley, who is an A-level teacher and an examiner for a leading exam board. Hi, Kate. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for inviting me this afternoon.
That's great.
I'm really pleased to be here.
It's really useful to get your advice on how to answer questions because I'm sure you're aware as well, but lots of students really enjoy the subject and often quite good when they're in discussions or debates, but really struggle when they come to put pen to paper.
Yes, I totally agree. I think some students become a little bit frustrated that they know the subject. They can talk quite easily about the subject, and when they come out of the exams, they're often quite disappointed because what's let them down is the exam skills that are needed to be successful, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. So it's not just about having the knowledge, but it's knowing how to answer your exams as well. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And whichever exam board you are with, there are basically the same style of questions. We have definition questions, shorter questions, and longer essays. So we're going to start with the short ones. If a student were to get a question where they have to define a term, so just a short question about a definition, what's your advice for that, Kate?
I would advise that they avoid repeating the words that is in the question and coming up with an alternative. For example, if you got asked something like what is meant by a reconstituted family, a family that's reconstituted, that's not going to get any other marks. So try and use a different word that would describe or explain that word. I'd also advise that if you're often not sure, sometimes by giving an example, you arrive at the definition by explaining it that way. Yeah. So that's sometimes quite useful for students to be able to apply that as well.
Yeah. And would you also say that if it is a definition, keep it brief? I've seen some students write almost a page of writing for maybe a 2-mark question.
I would definitely advise that as well. And this is where timing comes in as well. So use the recommended time limit. If you're going beyond the time, move on. Don't spend too long on those short questions. You're going to compromise what you're going to get from the longer questions, which are obviously worth more.
Yeah, excellent. So that's our key piece of advice for definitions. Don't use the same word to define the term. I think that's good advice. And then the next style of questions that we often see, whichever exam board you're with, is kind of the questions where they ask you to give 2 examples of, or 3 examples, or short explanations. What's your advice for those shorter style questions?
So again, we often find that students typically write too much for these. So stick to the time limit that's been allocated for that type of question, and that will give you a bit of guidance about how much you should be writing, because that's sometimes what students ask is, how much do I write for a 4-mark, or how much do I write for a 6-mark? So use that as a little bit of guidance. Also, we recommend that students start each point on a new line. Now, we're not expecting students to be bullet pointing. I'm not saying bullet point, but definitely start each point on a new line, because then it becomes really clear that they're giving 2 points or 3 points, whether it's a 4-mark or a 6-mark. And it just becomes really easy for the examiner to identify the points that the students are making. You don't have to hunt within a paragraph or a big chunk of text. So I definitely advise breaking up the answer. It doesn't have to be in a neat paragraph. It can be new line for each new point that the student makes. And also the examiner will credit the ones that are correct. So if they are unsure, they can offer a further one as well. Now, you can't be just offering loads and loads of others,
Yes.
because obviously you're going to go over the time limit. But sometimes you might think of 3, maybe 4 things that might be plausible, and if you put those down, they will credit the ones that are correct. They will look at them all and they'll credit the ones that are right.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I definitely agree. You're an examiner. I've examined before. Make the examiner's life easy. If you put your answers on different lines, it's really clear and obvious the 2 points that you're making, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to give you the mark. You don't want them to be working hard.
Yes.
You want to basically give it them on a plate so they can award it nice and clearly.
Let's move on to some questions have an item attached. Is it fair to say that, Kate, a lot of students kind of ignore the item, go straight into the question, they forget to read it, or they only briefly skim over it, don't they? So what's your advice where you've got a question that has an item attached to it?
So the advice that I give to, especially to my students, is before you even start to put pen to paper on your answer sheet, is that you read the item and then you read it again, but this time you underline or you circle, and then do the same with the question as well, to then familiarise yourself with what the question's actually asking, and is there actually any clues in the item that will help you answer the question. So then you can go back to the item and spend a bit of time annotating it, getting down some ideas, and then using that to just spend a couple of minutes to do a little bit of a plan as well, and that will utilise the item as much as you can. You haven't got long in the exam, but it is well worth spending that time just reading the question and the item more than once and doing some annotations on it as well. So at least then you're fully clear that you understand exactly what the question is asking you to do. How many times might you have students that have started writing, done a paragraph and then said, oh, I misunderstood the question, I had to start again. Yeah. I think just spending 1 or 2 minutes at the beginning just avoids that.
And if the question does say with reference to the item, the student does need to use it, don't they?
I would advise students to say according to the item. It doesn't take a long time to do it, but at least then you know at some point in your answer you have made it really clear to the examiner that you have used it and that you've applied your knowledge to it. Again, it's like what we were saying with the short questions. Make it easy for the examiner to give you marks. So using these little signposts really just helps the examiner understand that you are answering what the question is asking you to do.
Yeah, and often I think it's worth saying to students, if you do it nice and early in your essay, because even if you forget to refer back to it later on, at least you know you've done it at least once.
And often students will refer to something in the item, sometimes unknowingly.
Yeah.
So, just having that bit of a checklist, okay, make sure I refer to the item and in your plan or whatever, it just means that you can tick it off and then you know that you've answered that part of the question.
Excellent. We're now going to talk about the essays, because I think most students are fairly okay with short mark questions, and once they get the technique of them, they're okay. Let's start with the skills. So it's often said, whichever exam board you're using, it's said that there's 3 different types of skills that the examiner's looking for. So do you just want to clarify what those 3 different skills are for us?
Yeah, okay, so we'll start off with AO1. Now, AO1 is your knowledge and understanding, and we can demonstrate good knowledge and understanding through use of keywords, concepts, sociologists' names, and that just shows that you know what you're talking about and you can demonstrate that you understand what that question is about, okay? Now, the AO2 is more about application, and it could come in more than one form. It could be you're applying knowledge from the items, you are applying examples to show that you understand, or you're applying it to the question. So, for example, if you're using a question which is talking about students' educational achievements, if you then say, so therefore this shows that working class underachieve, that's applying it to the question through the wording of what you're using can show application. And then finally, the AO3 is split into 2. You've got your analysis and you've got your evaluation. Now, your analysis is your understanding of how an explanation can be broken down and then put that together, basically. And analysis can be shown in a number of ways. And the easiest way that I can describe what analysis is if you're talking about, like, for example, class and achievement, you can then explain why students underachieve might be because of material deprivation. Now, if you then start to compare it to why the middle class might not be materially deprived and make that comparison, that is some form of analysis. You are looking at it from a different angle and you're showing that you really do have that deep understanding why some students might underachieve. Okay, so making a comparison is often a way. So another way that you could show analysis might be using the acronym CAGES, and some of the teachers might have used this within class when you've been studying different subject topics. So basically what CAGES stands for is class, age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality. So whatever you're looking at, if you can look at a different class like I used in that previous example, or if you could compare genders or ethnicities and look at it from a different angle, does that explanation still apply? By looking at it from a different angle, that is seen as analysis. And then finally, evaluation is positive or negative. What's the strength? What's the weakness of whatever you're being asked about? So any criticisms often will come with evaluation.
And as an examiner, Kate, do you find it's quite common that students focus very heavily on their knowledge? They learn all their sociologists, all the keywords and so on. So they've got all of this knowledge in there, but then it's that kind of the other skills of analysis, counter-argument, evaluation that they kind of miss off.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the way that they would revise it. When they are revising and they're studying for their exams, they spend a lot of time focusing on knowledge retrieval because students believe, well, if I don't know it, I'm not going to be able to write about it. So if they're focusing on the knowledge retrieval, often the skills of application and the skills of analysis and evaluation are often neglected, because how can you do it if you're just learning content? So what I would really advise is, while you are revising, you've got to be practicing exam questions, because that will force you to incorporate those skills rather than just learning via, say, Quizlet. Let's learn the content.
Yes.
Rather, you to be practicing exam questions to practice those skills.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So, Kate, if a student was practicing an essay for a first time, what could they do with that essay to make sure that they're covering those different types of skills?
So I would get 3 different coloured pens, one which is going to be your AO1 pen, one that's going to be your AO2 pen, and one that's going to be your AO3 pen, and read back through your answer. So every time you've got a keyword or a key name, you highlight that with your AO1 pen, because that's showing that you've got knowledge. And where you've applied an example, you could use the second AO2 pen, or where you've used the item, or where you have made a link to the exam question where you're saying, therefore, this shows or this supports the question or this challenges the question. You could highlight with that with your AO2 pen. And then where you've tried or you've attempted to make a comparison, or you have made or you've broken down your explanation that little bit further to look at it from a different angle, you can highlight it with your AO3 for analysis. Or where you've offered some sort of criticism or some positive evaluation, you can highlight it with your AO3. So your answer should then become a little bit more multicoloured. So you don't want all of it in the one colour for AO1. You want to see a bit of AO1, let's back it up with an example, or let's use the item to support what I'm saying, let's link it to the question, and then let's evaluate the point that I've just made, and then move on to the next paragraph. So they become a bit stripy, your paragraphs.
Yes.
And then you'll be able to visually see if you're missing some of the skills, what you're missing, and you know exactly what you need to work on.
Excellent. That's really good advice. And another question, Kate, to do with essays, I get asked this quite a lot by students. How important are introductions and conclusions?
Okay, so with an introduction, it is not essential to have it on a essay. I would advise, if students are running out of time, you could go straight into your answer. But an introduction often sets the scene of your answer, and you can get some early knowledge in there. You can get some early evaluation in there as well within your introduction if it is done well. But again, it's not essential. It doesn't state it on the mark scheme to have an introduction. Now, but if students are doing academic writing, I think they do need to know how to do an introduction, especially if they're going into the next stage in their education. Really, if they're going to university, they'll need to know how to do an introduction. So I don't personally believe in skipping that, but it's not essential in an answer. It's not stated on the mark scheme. What is stated on the mark scheme is a conclusion. And I would definitely urge that students try to tie up their answer and come to some form of conclusion at the end.
Yeah. And often to get into the top band, it does say overall conclusion or evaluation, doesn't it?
Yeah. If they're looking to get that top band and they're looking for those top grades, they need to be able to conclude their answers. So that is something else they need to incorporate into the revision and exam skill practice, is writing conclusions as well to answers.
And the conclusion as well should not just be a repetition of something they've already said elsewhere in the essay. It should be sort of a distinct conclusion, shouldn't it?
Yeah. You don't want to repeat what you've already said. You want to come to some sort of judgment on the whole. What is this telling you? What does this show to you? What do you now know about this? And maybe you could even mention, what does it not take into account?
Yeah.
To show that you understand that the arguments that you have given, you've looked at both sides, which is often the case, or you've evaluated them as you go along, and you've come to a judgment at the end.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to fall down on one side of the argument either, does it? Nope. It could be impartial or somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, of course. It just says a reasoned conclusion.
Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, a lot of students do this when they first start sociology. You pick up an essay and they've written, I think that, I believe that. Where do you stand on that, Kate? Because let's say that you get a question about why do boys underperform in education. If they start an essay saying, I think that, and all the way through it's their opinion, how does the examiner interpret that?
Well, it depends whether they're backing what they're saying, what they believe, up with the evidence from sociological viewpoints, really. Yes. I think we need to be thinking about, we're not just training students for the exam, we're training students to be academic writers, especially if they go into university. And writing with the I believe, I think is not an academic way of writing, and it just takes a little bit of training for them to write according to the item. The first explanation is that reads a lot better, especially to an examiner.
Yeah, especially if it's asking, the question's wanting you to apply sociological theory. It wants to hear from the experts, not your personal subjective opinion, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So you want to be saying according to whichever research or whatever question that you're talking about. So if you're talking about childhood, you would say according to Palmer, for example, and so on. So I would discourage students from using that, but I know that some of the way that they write in high school does encourage them to write in that way. So it does take a little bit of training to encourage them to write from that, from that other person perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because there's not a one size fits all for how to write an essay for all subjects. What a sociology essay looks like could be different from English or history or so on as well. And the last question I wanted to ask you, Kate, this is often a question that students ask when they're trying to improve and get to the top. Let's say that students are going for the very best. They want to try and achieve an A, if not an A star. What do you think is distinctive of essays at that very, very top band compared to maybe a B or a C grade essay?
When I'm looking at the top band answers, they tend to have a little bit more flair to them. You can tell that they've read around the subject. They've not just took on board what their teachers have taught them or the textbook is saying. They have read newspaper articles, they might have watched documentaries, so they have this wider knowledge which they then can apply in their answers as well, which does enhance it. It shows that they really understand what they're writing about. And if we go back to the skills, the top band answers tend to be very consistent with their skills. They don't offer generic evaluation. feminists would criticise this because it ignores boys or something like that, or ignores girls or whatever. They're very specific in what and how they're evaluating. They'll have a point that they've made and they'll follow it through. They don't jump from point to point. They go into it, they dig into detail, and then they will evaluate and they'll analyse that point, and then they'll move on. Whereas some weaker answers tend to be a little bit more descriptive. The evaluation tends to be a little bit more generic. They're not always making it clear whether they are linking it very specifically to the question. Whereas your top band students tend to be very tightly knitted to what that question is asking, and they're just really hitting those skills very consistently, and they're ending with that, that brilliant conclusion at the end where they understand that there is two sides, and they come to a conclusion which is based on the evidence that they've put forward.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And listeners, if you imagine Kate could be sat with a pile of 300 papers to mark, and a lot of them will look very, very similar, right? If you've got a question on, a lot of the answers will look exactly the same. And it takes something to stand out, to rise up, which really sort of makes you sit up in your chair to say, well, this one's a little bit different. This one's a little bit more unique, right?
Yeah, definitely. You can tell the centres which have been very good at prepping their students, very formulaic in their answers. But sometimes you do get an outstanding student which just adds something to it. You can tell that they can bring in their own experience into their answer because they've read around the subject. And I think if you are wanting to be a top band or a top grade student, you really got to immerse yourself into sociology. You've got to remember, society is out there, and what you're studying is a subject that you're living. So when you're talking about education, you are part of the education system. It is in the news. You are experiencing it. So read up on it, so then you really understand what is meant by, this class divide or marketisation policies or whatever. These are happening to you as a student. So understand it, embrace it.
Yeah, and
that's what I would advise students.
Definitely, I definitely agree with that wider reading as well, because you're kind of classic sociologists, or your best known sociologist, everyone's going to have learnt those. But when you open a paper and you go to mark something and a name pops up that you might not have even heard of yourself as the examiner, or someone's used a contemporary study that was only done last year, I think that's something that really stands out.
It makes a difference, and to be reassuring to students as well, because they're often quite fearful of referring to studies that are not in the textbook. Yeah, and the mark scheme clearly states that you can refer to these studies and others that might apply. So if an examiner does come across a study that they're not familiar with, the examiner is required to follow that up to see whether it does apply in that answer. I know myself as an examiner, I want to make sure that these are applying these studies in the correct way, especially if I come across ones which I'm a bit less familiar with. Yeah.
Any last advice, Kate, for students, particularly for essay writing? Is there any other top tips you would give just to sign off?
So I would definitely say practice them. Okay, practice in timed conditions. Don't let it be the first time that you do an essay in that mock exam or that final exam. You need to be practicing them. I would even say for students that are starting and they're starting new to sociology this September, as soon as you've done that first topic, have a look at an exam question. Consider how would you answer it. And no doubt there will be maybe a model answer for at least that topic, definitely. And have a look at it. How is it answered? So then you become a little bit more familiar to what is actually expected of you. We're not expecting students in September to be producing A-grade answers. It's a learning curve, but at least you can start practicing those skills as you go along. So when you get to that final hurdle at the end of 2 years, you've had a full 2 years of practicing these types of questions.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And actually, yeah, to students, don't get too frustrated, because it does take a while to learn the skills and what the examiner's looking for. And you're not expected, as he said, to get A grade straight away. So if it takes you a little bit of time to get there and the technique right, that's absolutely fine.
Some students only come into their own in the second year. Yeah, they only come in and then all of a sudden they go, do you know what you were saying? I get that now. I get it. I've got it. And it takes practice. And what I would urge students to do is to be resilient.
Yes.
Okay. Don't look at the grades that they get in. Just think about, have you developed your skills? Are you getting better at applying those skills? Don't worry about the grades that you get in, especially when you're practicing exam questions, but are you getting better at the skills as you go through? And that's what you need to take away from it, rather than just focusing on, oh, that first essay that I did, it was a D grade equivalent. Yeah, well, a lot of them will be a D grade equivalent, because we don't expect students to be able to evaluate, to that standard. True. And also, the best evaluation only comes from when you've studied all the topics.
Definitely some good advice there, Kate. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I think the students will have got some very valuable information there as well.
Oh, I hope so. I hope I've answered a lot of questions, and hopefully it's been quite reassuring to them that the examiner is not your enemy and you can do lots of things in order to maximise your marks. Remember, the examiner is your friend and they do want to award things when they see it.
That's good for them to hear. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you again for asking me.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for the Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes, and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.